If you are a SaaS founder, if you're looking to build a SaaS product, I don't think there's any reason that you should run scared of somebody saying we're going to do this as an SPA. I also don't think there's any reason that you should just embrace that with wide arms.
Welcome to SaaS That App, building B2B web applications, the podcast where we share real-world stories, practical advice, and tech insights for those building or thinking about starting a tech-enabled business. I'm your co-host, Aaron Marchbanks.
And I'm Justin Edwards. Each week we bring you the stories, strategies, and insights you need to build your SaaS or tech-enabled business smarter, not harder. Let's dive right in.
Glad to have you joining us for today's topic, which is why single-page applications suck. Subtitle, a reasonably fair assessment of single-page applications and multi-page applications with a strong preference for the former. Joining me today is my co-host, Mr. Justin Edwards, CIO, among other things, of Delta Systems. Welcome, Justin.
Howdy. Super happy to be here.
And also Daniel Cannon, who is the Chief Innovation Officer, also of Delta Systems. Daniel, thanks for being here.
Hey, how's it going?
Going well. So these two yahoos have co-owned software businesses together, consulted on, helped start, often maintain, or rebuild applications, and they are also amazing developers in their own rights. Working in industries and applications ranging from like food service to medical assessments. And as an added bonus, I get to work with these guys every day. So hope you enjoy our conversation. Guys, let me set the stage here just a little bit. So what we're talking about here is distinguishing between single-page applications and multi-page applications. So single-page application, basically we're just talking about an application that runs pretty much entirely within the browser. It doesn't require an entire page to be reloaded during use. We're talking about a goal being like faster transitions, making websites feel a lot more snappy, a lot more like native mobile applications, and more often than not are using some flavor of JavaScript, React or Vue or Angular, things along those lines. So think like Gmail or Google Maps or Facebook's news feed, Netflix, stuff like that. On the other side of the coin, we have multi-page applications. And so this is something that's a little bit more traditional. It loads a new page for every action that a user is going to take, typically consist, as its name implies, of multiple pages that are more static, load a new page from the server, and then update the content of that page. Here we're talking about things like e-commerce sites. So think Amazon or Etsy, news service sites, traditional websites that have multiple pages that you're clicking through to get things to happen. So I'm going to start with Justin. First of all, did I get that right?
Yeah, I'd say you're pretty much spot on.
Good deal. So, Justin, give us the overarch here. Why is it that the single-page version of this sucks?
Yeah, I mean, so look, there's different things to consider. I think the popularity of single-page applications and their utility and their benefits are super overblown. I think the main reason is that they're really relatively new compared to like multi-page applications. And so because it's this shiny, lustrous new thing, people went running towards it without maybe taking time to appreciate some of the drawbacks of this new technology and because there was so much irrational exuberance in adopting this and this cool new thing that was coming out, I think that we didn't take a minute to assess if it was the right solution for all the problems that it's been applied for. And I think in a number of ways, it's demonstrably worse than the archaic, older, multi-page applications, more standard general frameworks.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so I can speak to some specific issues with multi-page or single-page applications and the challenges they kind of introduce, but that's like the big picture of, I guess, the why they suck or why they're misapplied very frequently.
Daniel is just on there with improper application from the new hotness.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that's probably a little bit overly harsh. Listen, I mean, single-page apps are definitely kind of like the new way of making web application. It's the experience that you're used to. When you go to like Facebook, for example, you don't want every time you like a comment to have a page load and have it, spin, and then all of a sudden it lights up and it says, hey, blue, it's liked. So, modern apps, interactive apps, you expect to have that kind of single-page feel, and it's pretty standard now that if you just click a like button on something, it just lights up blue. Yeah, there's drawbacks, there's complications to it. I mean, I think I'd have a hard time saying SPAs suck. I think that's probably a little overly harsh. I know that's the topic today. But, I would say oftentimes there is a decision made for these front-end frameworks that just isn't really justified by the problem that you're trying to solve. If you're Facebook, you want to have something that's extremely interactive. You want to offload all of the performance onto the user's browser. I mean, there's a lot of reasons you want to do that. For your average SaaS startup, I think most of the time, I think Angular, React, I think these front-end frameworks is actually probably not the right call, which is a little contrarian. But yeah, I think that would probably be my take on it.
Just to push back a little bit on the idea that having any kind of interactivity is necessarily a single page app, like for the example, I'm not anti using JavaScript or having these kind of dynamic interactions in the front end. And in fact, all the traditional single page or multi-page tools rather provide for that stuff. It's biting off this every single front end interaction is going to go through this kind of convoluted state management mechanism and have all this kind of super complicated interactivity as opposed to just like little tiny things, little tiny components of interactivity. So like the like button example will be well accomplished in a multi-page app as well. And you're right that you don't want to deal with a page load for that.
Yeah. I mean, with all technologies, there's trade-offs, and there's never, something where it's like, oh, this is the silver bullet and it does everything exactly how I want. So you're making the trade-off. When you want to have it be really interactive and responsive, oftentimes the trade-off you're making is that you're going to have data consistency issues. You click the like button and the like button lights up blue and everything looks happy to the user, but in the back end, we've actually not liked the post. And so when you refresh the page, that like button goes away. In an ideal world, you wouldn't have either of those problems, but the interactive, sort of SPA approach, you're gonna see that immediately as the user, and it might not be consistent with the backend. Whereas in the traditional multi-page app, it's not gonna be as pleasant an experience for the user, but your data is gonna be consistent. It's gonna be right.
Let's start with the user experience. I mean, that's the thing that everybody sees first. The vast majority of the time when a startup or a founder or a tech lead or someone is approaching this. As often as not, they'll approach it from that front end, that user experience. What is it that an end user is going to see? We'll deal with how we make that happen later, right? So if what I'm hearing is right from you guys, really it doesn't make too much of a difference in terms of what the user can see. Components can be the same between single-page applications, multi-page applications. We're talking about the actual interactivity of those components. Is that right?
Yeah, I'd say that's right. It's how the user interacts with the page, how quickly their actions reflect on the page that they're seeing.
Right. So, button clicks, likes, things along those lines. Doesn't necessarily take you to a new page, require the page load. So potentially we're talking about a faster or more streamlined user experience on the single page application side of things versus multi-page application side of things. But functionally, things can work the same way.
I would say in general, and I mean, obviously there's a lot of, I'm sure we're going to get into it, but there's a lot of kind of trade-offs between SPAs and MPAs. There's a lot of middle ground like Turbo, which I'm a huge fan of, which really gives you that SPA experience while actually being a multi-page app, but it doesn't feel like one to the user. So there are a lot of trade-offs in the middle, but I'd say generally what you said is right. Yeah.
Yeah, just one correction. I think in a single page application, even the page navigation is happening 100% of the front end. So that's more of a user experience decision that it feels like a navigation happened, but in reality, it didn't, right? So in the single page world, there's not really a distinction between changing pages and pressing a button, except for how you decide to what you decide to show the user when they do something. So in the case of a button click, say you want to like something, you press the button, there's an exchange that happens in the back end and you light up a blue icon that says you did a good job liking this, nicely done. You click on a hyperlink, for instance, that works the exact same way. It sends the exact same backend request, but instead of turning the button blue this time, you deload everything that's on the page and load a new page or have something slide in or a modal pop up or whatever your version of that is.
So that starts to feel more like a performance issue. User experience, all things being equal. We're talking about load times, perhaps application size, complexity, things along those lines.
Right. So look, I mean, when single page apps are really well written and when they perform well, when you have a good internet connection, user experience is hands down better. That's my take on it anyway. We could argue about Turbo, which is somewhere in the middle, but that's kind of a distraction from like the main the main point. Let's say we're using Rails without Turbo versus we have a React front end. If the React front end is well written and optimized correctly and your internet connection is good and all those kinds of things, like that experience is going to be nicer, more seamless, more smooth than the Ruby on Rails analogous experience. So that's true, and that's a laudable ideal, I guess. But then there's all the problems that you bite off and all the things you have to take on when you make that decision that you want to go for this really, this last 10% of user experience for moving to a single page application.
And this may be too big of a blanket categorization to make, but would you say that something leaning more towards a single page application is more performative than a multi-page application?
Daniel might have a different take on this than I do, but I would say actually no. I would say it's less performative, but the experience is better for users. So when you load a single page application, you actually have to load more content than your multi-page counterpart because the interactions are more rich and it takes more actual bytes to power that experience. And then B, you also have things like skeletons because you do actually need data from the server in order to display these things. So now you have placeholder images that you're also loading on top of the data back from the server. So your user can look at, gray lines going across as opposed to just waiting for a page to load because we've decided that's a better experience.
Yeah, I would say the performance question is not really a binary. It's not a question of which is more performant and which is less performant. It's whose performance are we concerned about? Why did Facebook invent React? Or they're Meta now, but they were Facebook then. Why did they invent React? One of the big reasons, yes, they wanted to improve the user experience. One of the big ones is they wanted to shift the load off of their servers onto your device. So when you're using a React app, your browser, your phone goes out and downloads this big old bundle from the internet, and then you run that in the browser, and all the computation, all the work is done by you, and you just have to tell the server the occasional thing here and there. So, I think that was a big part of it, is how can we offload the work, the computer time, the compute cycles onto the user's devices. I think there is also another nice thing with SPAs from a performance standpoint is that you can deploy them using CDNs. So you can use CloudFront or something like that. And now, these bundles are cached all throughout the internet. So you're not having to go all the way to Seattle to go and get the application. You're just going to go, next door, Denver, wherever you happen to be. You're going to get it. You're going to download it. It's all running on your browser really quickly. You don't have to wait for the API for every single little thing. Every time you load a page, we're going to download all the styles, all of everything. Obviously there's other caching that comes in there as well. But for the most part, once you bite the bullet of downloading the bundle into your browser, now you're pretty much just running the application and you don't have to have a lot of network communication.
To tag on to the end of that, another thing that SPAs do really well is, to Daniel's point, once you have that bundle, you actually have an application that might have utility that doesn't require an internet connection. And that can be beneficial. Anyone who's used Google Docs offline or has done some Facebook interacting offline has had that benefit. Like, I don't have internet, but I can still kind of see some stuff that was downloaded before I lost my connection. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, an awesome thing that you can do with Angular, with React, is you can build what's called a PWA. There's a few more steps to get to that, but a PWA is literally an application that gets installed in your browser, and just like Google Docs, the example Justin gives, it works offline. If you want to turn that into a mobile app, it's very easy to take your PWA, wrap it up, put it in the App Store. Great. Now you got a mobile app. If you got a mobile optimized website, it's pretty much just a few steps to get to having a mobile app. So huge upsides there, especially for SaaS founders.
The dark negative side of that, though, is that you've now decided that cache invalidation is a problem that you want to deal with.
That was going to be my next question.
Right, and I don't know, I'll get the joke wrong, but it's like there's only like 4 hard problems in computer science, which is like naming things cache invalidation and off by 1 errors, something like that. So
that makes sense.
Yeah. So anyway, cache invalidation is a really hard problem, and why I provided all the qualifiers earlier of saying, like, when an app is really well written, it's really, really easy to get into troubles with caching. And like the bane of my existence when I'm on a single page application is I'm trying to go take an action. I click on like my profile image because I want to go to my settings page, for example, and then I go and then I click on the settings button to move to my settings page. Except between when I made the button click and when the click got processed, the entire navigation loaded, and then I clicked on some place that I didn't want to go to. Because the navigation from the server finally loaded. And so it's like this loading was happening in the background, but the user experience is now worse than a multi-page application because of this delay and response time and also, bad design potentially.
What would one do then to mitigate some of that caching issue? Daniel talked a little bit about, utilizing CDNs and Cloudflare and things along those lines, but for folks out there that may not be too terribly familiar with it, while caching can improve the performance, like you say, because it's all localized, how do you deal with cache busting and making sure that everybody has the current JavaScript libraries, at the highest level, and then all the way down to the application packages?
Yeah, to kind of tear that off into 2 separate things, there is the caching and distribution of the source files to allow users to run the application. And so that's like, to Dana's point, CloudFront, CDNs, all that stuff. That's great. But then there's also the caching of actual application data. So my app goes out to the server and asks for what items should be in my navigation. And then it has a version of what it thinks should be in the navigation. And then I go into the database in the web application and I make an update there. And now the application server has a different idea for what items should be in my navigation. And how do we determine whether the navigation that's on the server or the navigation that's on the device is the most up to date? That example isn't the most apt because in that case, you probably just take the server version all the time. But there are versions of this that are not so easy to determine, like if a user is say there's like a financial app and a user's increasing a dollar amount by pressing an up money, up money, up money button, and the server has some representation of what the transaction size is supposed to be. Well, the user's version of that is arguably more correct until the actual transaction is processed, and the server's version is more correct. And again, these are toy examples, but there are, every single user interaction, you have to think about whose version of this data is more correct or should be kind of trusted. And yeah, there are other things that come into that as well.
I think, like Justin said, there's kind of two problems here. One of them is the caching of the code, and one of them is the caching of the data. The caching of the code's really not that hard of a problem to solve. You stick a version in your bundle. I don't know. It's that one to me is a pretty easy one. Making sure everyone has the most up to date code. The data caching is a huge pain. Anytime you've gone to a website that has a search bar and you start typing and you're like, oh, there's the thing that I want to click, and then you go to click on it and then that changes to something else, and now all of a sudden you're looking at an article about corn harvesting, and that's not what you wanted at all. That's caching issues. We're trying to present this really nice, responsive, snappy user interface while we wait for the server to tell us what the reality is of the universe. Then the server gets back and tells us, and then we have to change the front end on you. Yeah, so I mean, those are big issues. There's lots of ways for solving data caching problems, but it is kind of like the joke Justin told. It's about the hardest problem in computer science. Cache invalidation is a very tricky thing to solve.
Yeah, and again, it's just like, cool, so we're biting off this thing that we know is hard, that's going to take a lot of time and energy and money to deal with, and to deal with properly, and to also achieve that better user experience, which is the reason we bit off, presumably the reason we bit off the single page app decision to begin with. Barring Daniel's point about scalability for like our SaaS founders and people who work with us, like we're typically not concerned about offloading CPU cycles to the user on average. And at that scale, you have money to rewrite, so it is what it is. But so anyway, you're biting off this thing that you know is difficult and expensive and hard and going to take time. So like, what are you getting in exchange, right? And so that's the trade-off that people have to make when they have to understand the trade-offs when they're making their decisions about what technologies to push their application out in.
Gotcha. So, kind of related to caching then is I'm assuming the application size itself. Libraries, of course, package things that have to come along for all the different utility that you want to have, or tool sets. But between the single page application and the multi-page application approaches, I'm going to make an assumption here that those single page applications, all other things being equal, the application size itself is smaller because it does need to be delivered to the browser, or is it larger?
It's hard to answer because it's complicated. What is the application here? I would say so. The front end bundle that you serve out to the user is probably going to end up being pretty well compressed if you're doing it right. I don't know. I mean, I've worked with a lot of projects where you end up having a bundle JS that's like a gigabyte. It's like, guys, how did this happen? It's like, well, we just packed every library into the bundle. Ordinarily, I mean, if you go to facebook.com, for example, is the one that keeps coming up. Most of those libraries are actually getting loaded from a CDN, and most people have them cached. Your browser probably has multiple copies of Bootstrap cached. You're not going to go load Bootstrap every single time that you go to the site. So you can actually offload a lot of stuff. You can take a lot of stuff out of the bundle, put it in the internet, depending upon browser caches to handle that for you. Usually the bundle's not particularly big. It's probably going to be bigger than like a single page load. Like if you want to just talk about the HTML in a page, the bundle's going to be dramatically larger than that. But again, you load it once. So if you're only ever going to see one page, it's probably like, and like, so like for SEO purposes, for example, like WordPress, why is the whole internet written in WordPress? Well, you're actually trying to get that initial page load really, really small. You want to load really, really fast so that you score high on all the performance rankings. You do not want to do your marketing site in Angular because that first load is going to take forever. Once you've actually downloaded the bundle, now everything's really snappy. So if you're going to keep interacting with the site, you don't have to do a whole lot of downloading, but that first load is going to take forever. So you don't do your marketing site in Angular, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I agree with what Daniel said. I think on average, your JavaScript bundle, like the user has to download more in a single page application than in a multi-page application on average. But unless it's particular for like your business use case, machine cycles are cheap, bandwidth is cheap, programmers are expensive. So it's not the right thing to optimize on 90+% of the time.
Right. Well, and that is a good point too, because these days the world is small and everybody's wired. You have the processing power in your pocket that we could only have dreamed of 20, 25 years ago. So the trade-off between server cycles versus, something that's more local is not quite the big concern that it used to be. But still yet, application size does matter. And I would think as an extension of that, as a function of the complexity and getting into more technical details about that and something that I haven't had to deal with for quite a few years. So you guys are going to be closer to the tip of the spear on this. But in terms of like, maintenance, complexity of the application, I would again think that A single page application is going to be more complex in that you have to have it pretty well thought out, maintaining it and keeping it updated. There are going to be more interactive components or more things that are going on and therefore more potential issues that could arise than on a multi-page application that can be more structured, more formulaic, more traditional. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, the more complex the application, the more maintenance there is. You can get a pretty complicated multi-page application. I mean, we've got some Rails applications that are very, very, very complicated. I mean, I will definitely say there's been a real tendency in the front-end world to just go crazy with libraries, and pretty much any package JSON you open up for any large application is just 100 things. I don't even know what half of these things are, and all of those have to be maintained. All of those have to be updated. All of them are potential security vulnerability. Honestly, most of them are open source libraries that you're installing from GitHub. And I'm here to tell you, not every single commit gets audited. And I won't remember the details, but there was just a big exploit of this a while ago where somebody snuck something into a popular open source library that I think was doing something for like formatting developer console outputs. So it was some kind of just cute little tool. And then it wound up actually being, oh, here's a huge backdoor. Then now all of a sudden we can hack your app. So yes, the larger the bundle, the larger your attack surface from a security standpoint, the larger your maintenance requirements, the more you need to upgrade those libraries. I wouldn't say that would be a big reason for me to decide between an SPA or an MPA, decide between Ruby, Angular, or Rails, but it is certainly a consideration.
I think a lot of times the choice you end up making is, do you want to have one application where you take front of like Rails assets, the Rails pipeline, and how to kind of all the things that ship with Rails to make multi-page applications, or do you want to have Rails act as an API and then have a separate front-end only application? So you can't end up basically with two code bases where otherwise it would have been one. It's going to vary by application. I don't think you can generally say that multi-page or single page are more complicated, but if your site is relatively simple and doing relatively simple things, there's no reason not to use all the stuff that ships with Rails, especially like for most of our customers, for most of the people that we work with, like having this really, really sexy user experience is not that important. I mean, the people are paying for the software because it does something that they need and it needs to work well. And we want to make it a pleasure to use, but it's not like Facebook or something where this really sleek UX is like, oh yeah, if we have any friction, then we're not going to be able to serve more ads to this person that we've kept on platform, right? And that's what Facebook is optimizing on, right? It's like no friction. This person has to stay here. If they scroll down, we have to show them something else they might want to see. We need pictures, we need ads, and that's not our customers, right? Our customers are solving real world problems, and their customers are using their applications because they do something that's useful, and they probably don't care that much if the screen slides in from the left or if they have to wait half a second for a page load on a complicated interaction.
If I could volunteer one pro on the complexity front, one really nice thing's, yeah, so one thing Justin keeps talking about is, well, you write your backend in Rails, and well, you don't have to. You don't have to write your backend in Rails. You could actually write your backend in the same language as your front end. So one big pro of using front-end technology like React or Angular is that you can actually do your backend in JavaScript. It's actually a really common pattern to use Node as your backend application, your API server. Once you do that, now your entire stack, top to bottom, is JavaScript, which means you only have to hire JavaScript developers. It means that there's not as much kind of switching cost. If you have somebody who works in the backend and works in the front end, they're not having to switch languages in their head. And it also means that upgrades and all of that can kind of happen at the same time. When a new version of Node gets rolled out, that's going to impact your backend, that's going to impact your front end. So in a lot of ways, it could actually be a lot easier to do maintenance on an application where the entire thing top to bottom is in JavaScript and in the kind of same universe.
Daniel's exactly right with that. It's really common to see people unify behind both stacks to provide a little bit of a counterpoint or some other context or other things to consider. If you end up writing your backend in the wrong language because you don't want to have multiple languages, that's a much more expensive decision than having two programming languages. I'm not a Node Express fanboy, so whatever, we can have religious language wars, that doesn't really matter. But if Node is not the right actual technology, or if you're going to spend a lot more time and money or not have the right library support or whatever in Node, and you decide to go with Node anyway because your front end is also going to be in JavaScript and you want to have this kind of unified thing, it's a really expensive decision and potentially the wrong decision. So again, it's a little bit of the tail wagging the dog, and I don't know. It can work out well if you have one talented person, but it could potentially also be problematic. So that bug or that feature could be a bug. The other side of that is that front end and back end skill sets these days, especially, are like very different. And having that one unified perfect person who's just a crazy awesome JavaScript hacker with flames coming out of his fingers, who's just writing dollars into value all day long, both in the front end and making it sexy and beautiful on the front end. Like that person exists, but he makes a lot of money, and he probably makes enough money that you could hire one who's pretty good at both sides.
I was about to say, and that generally begs the question of what happens when that person disappears for whatever reason, moves on to a different organization, is no longer with the consulting company that you're working with, or there's like some wholesale redo of, for whatever reason, we're going to change dev shops. And here is what this application has been written in. I'm handing it now to you guys, and we have this laundry list of features, but it's all in technologies or libraries or what have you that you may not be as familiar with. I know everybody, like I said, everybody has a particular fandom, I guess, toward various libraries or structures or patterns or, languages and what have you. But how do you deal with those language differences and the application that comes in the door already written, needing to be maintained in its, current code base if you don't have that person?
That's probably a podcast episode all by itself. I probably have an hour of comments about looking for consultants and migrating projects between teams. And
well, I suppose more specifically then, is that a person that you send in the direction of another organization or another developer or another solution that, might better fit that? Or is that a situation where you just talk in terms of let's do a rebuild or rewrite or, refactoring of some sort?
I mean, it's super case by case, Aaron. So like if I have a client show up an application that looks really good, I think we can do a good job of maintaining, even if it's not like in Rails or whatever our core competency is. If I think we're going to be able to do a good job with it, then I'm happy to throw our hat in the ring. And I come in and I explain to people like, hey, this is not 90% of what we do, but it is in the 10% of what we can do. And this is a good application. There's no reason to bite off or rewrite. If I think that we're not going to be successful, it's in something we don't dabble in, then I say, hey, I would love to work with you, but we're not a fit for each other with your tech stack. So based on looking at this, not that I'm an expert in this, but I don't think it's a candidate for a rewrite. So you should find someone who can work with you and support this. It's just not us. And then that last kind of category is the burn it down and kill it with fire. And how did this happen? How did anyone allow this piece of software, if you want to call it that, come into existence? And let's just take that and kind of set it aside as a seminar and a lesson learned. And then let's re-implement this in a way that's going to long-term work for your business. Fortunately, that doesn't happen all that often, but I've done it more than once in my career.
Sure, and I know Daniel has. Yeah, I think you're actually in the throes of doing some of that right now, as a matter of fact. But do you have a particular stance on that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there are good developers and bad developers in every language. I don't think you should make your language choice based upon hiring good developers, bad developers. I will say, I mean, there's a common adage that cheap is expensive, which I believe in a big way. I think a lot of people think, oh, great, we're going to do this entire thing in JavaScript. We're going to have Angular and React, and we're going to have Node on the back end, and we'll do the whole thing top to bottom JavaScript. Then all we have to do is hire JavaScript developers, and they're so cheap. We can find JavaScript developers who are so cheap, and then they'll be able to do the whole thing. And in general, if a developer is cheap, it's because they're not very good. It's just the reality of the situation. And I mean, I've worked with Ruby devs who are terrible too. I mean, I'm not just trying to throw fire on JavaScript. I think that if you're going to do your thing top to bottom in JavaScript, you should be looking to hire a very senior, very skilled JavaScript developer, and they exist. But they're hard to find these days. There's kind of a lot of people say JavaScript has kind of become the new PHP. It used to be everybody does PHP, and so it was so hard to find anybody who was actually a good PHP developer, because it's like, oh, I'm a configurator and I can stand up a WordPress site, therefore I'm a PHP developer. Oh, no, you're not. And it's the same with JavaScript. Everybody knows JavaScript. There's only some people who are actually really good JavaScript devs. And if you're a really good JavaScript dev, you're going to be able to step into a project, whether it's written in JavaScript or Go or Ruby or Fortran. I mean, you'll learn it. You'll figure it out. That's what good developers do. Good developers are kind of polyglots and aren't afraid of learning new languages.
Sure. So just to kind of bring us back to topic a little bit, when we're talking about JavaScript, obviously we're talking about JavaScript is heavier in these single page application scenarios. And so, when you're starting those things off, or you're picking up an existing one, that's where that skill set or those individuals come in very handy, because you have a heavier need in a particular direction, whichever way you happen to be going. If you don't happen to have the unicorn that Justin described to be able just to go in, do it all, soup to nuts, top to bottom, and have expertise in that. Something else I wanted to kind of get into a little bit too is for those that are interested in the marketing aspects of this. So, we have arrived at whatever determination that we've made. It's going to be a single page application. It's going to be a multi-page application, for these reasons. Here are our trade-offs that we're willing to make in terms of cache and complexity. Here is generally what we would like to see for front-end components, but maybe not interactivity. I'm to a point now where I want to, start talking a little bit about spreading the word and marketing this thing some. So, being able to get this out there, ordinarily there's going to be some sort of a mechanism, whether it's a social media sort of a campaign or a website that's going to market this application or utility, something outside of word of mouth, right? So kind of teetering a bit into search engine optimization. So SEO related to single page applications and multi-page applications. My kind of take on this is that the multi-page application, which is more traditional, would seem to orient itself better towards search engine optimization because you're getting that page load every time. You're moving between different pages, which are organized for different purposes, versus something that a browser and more specifically a search engine, the Googles of the world, will be able to interpret on something that's entirely in JavaScript and something that's entirely loading just the template. Effectively, that's all that the search engine sees. But talk to me a little bit, Daniel, about SEO as it relates to single page application versus a multi-page application and some pros and cons there.
Yeah, I mean, SEO is huge. I gave the example earlier about why you shouldn't do your marketing site in Angular and React. You want to have a quick first page load. So, I mean, that's huge. You're going to get dinged by the search engines if you have a big bundle. The other thing with the single page app is, you want to have lots and lots and lots of pages on your site potentially. So if you want to do something where it's like a marketplace where people are going to come and buy t-shirts or shoes or something like that, you probably want to have a page for each of your kinds of shoes, kinds of shirts. So somebody goes and searches for, I want a, alligator eating a potato on a t-shirt. They're going to find your t-shirt with an alligator eating a potato on it. And if you build the entire thing out as an SPA, getting those routes actually really hard. It's very easy to have, here's your landing page for, Joe's t-shirt shop, but trying to find the individual t-shirt is going to be really hard. And so we actually worked with somebody a while ago who built their entire marketplace app in React. And then they ran into this hurdle of, nobody can find our individual product pages. And they came to us and we went and figured out a way to do what's called server-side rendering. Which now gets into a really silly place for me with SPAs, but this is really common now because people solve this problem. They're like, well, we want to use Angular, we want to use React, but we also want to be able to have these pages that load quickly. We want to have routes that work where somebody can go to /t-shirt / alligator and get the alligator t-shirt. So what they actually do is they now render that on the server. The server will say, okay, we're going to build up a whole index of all these pages and we're going to compile them from the React source code to figure out what should be on that page so that we then have this page that can be rendered directly by the server. And now it's like, I feel like you're just the dog's eating its own tail.
I was about to say, you seem to be kind of defeating the purpose of having that fast load, right?
Well, the upside is that once you now go to that page, now everything's very interactive and snappy and zippy for the user. You're really only generating these routes, for people who come in specifically to that URL. So, I mean, there is an upside to it, but to me, you're biting off an awful lot of work, and it feels very silly to me to try to solve the problem this way, but a lot of people do it. It's very common.
So another thing just to tack on with that you're creating the complexity you introduce to your website when you do this is hard to understand as a non-developer because now we have a code base that I'm looking at that I used to be able to assume was happening on the browser with the user. And now half the time it doesn't. Half the time it's also happening on my server. And I have to know in my own head that this front end code is sometimes going to run on the server. It is really unintuitive. And there are people who are experts at it. I am not. I do see many, many junior and mid-level devs super twisted and confused because they just can't. I mean, it boggles the brain. And again, if SEO is important to you, why do we end up in the single page land? And maybe there's an answer for that. I'm not saying it's never the right call, but it seems like if like your SEO doing a product index, like the last thing you should be optimizing on is, or the last thing you should be like really like enthusiastic about is moving into a single page application. There are examples of Amazon, but our customers don't have the resources of Amazon.
Right. Yeah. Well, so it would seem to me that that's something that you probably want to try to establish early in the process, if not the outset. Is that something that's going to be important to you later because that can dictate the route that you take, right?
Yes. Yeah, I completely agree. And also just to say it, because some Google Analytics nerd is going to be upset. Yeah, Google is doing a ever increasingly better job of actually interpreting JavaScript, and they are improving their search engine, their scrapers and crawlers to be better at this. So work is being done. It has gotten a lot better. They are rolling out updates. I'm not an SEO goon, so ignorance claimed, but yeah, I know that they are doing work on that.
It's one of those situations where it's not going to go away anytime soon, and so you either have to embrace it as part of the part of the development environment, or you just have to let it go away. And they're choosing to not ignore it, which is good.
I would say one pretty interesting framework in this space that is worth looking at is Next.js. Next.js is kind of trying to be this hybrid everything application. So you kind of write it like it's a monolith. You write it just in JavaScript, but you can kind of designate, basically the front end is sort of React, and you can kind of designate, is this a React component that only renders in the client, or is this something that requires server-side capabilities? You kind of put this directive at the top of it. You say, oh, use client, or oh, use server. And if it says use client, now you can't talk to the server pieces. That now needs to become a client-side only component. But it's actually like eerily natural to write an application like this, I have to say. I've only worked on a few Next.js projects, and they all feel a little kind of gross and slimy. I'm not going to lie about that, but it starts to feel like pretty natural, where you're just kind of writing this and it's like, oh, I'm writing this web page, and at some point it'll be figured out whether this is on the client side or the server side, but you don't really need to worry about it too awful much. And again, the whole thing top to bottom is JavaScript. I still think it's a little immature. That's one of the main reasons I wouldn't recommend it for people, is it's just kind of a new technology, but I don't know, Next.js is definitely something to watch out for.
In a general sense, you talk about, or just Next.js?
Next.js is a new technology, yeah.
Yeah, but JavaScript in general, that's been around for ages. That's why I just want to get clarification there. We know that some of these programming languages have been around for an eternity, but
have you heard about this new language called JavaScript? How about HTML? Have you heard of that one? No. JavaScript is very mature. Next.js is very new.
And all this time, I thought I was writing ExemoScript.
So I feel like we're kind of building up also this list of questions that need to have answers kind of at the outset, and things that, if I put on my business owner or startup person hat, things that we need to be aware of, obviously, going into these situations as you're ready to have these conversations with would-be developers or development shops or recruitment or hiring, as you will. The obvious stuff, how do you want this thing to look and work? What's the interactivity with the user? What's the problem that you're trying to solve for? Is performance going to be an issue? And if so, what performance elements are going to be at issue here that we need to deal with? As we just kind of wrapped up here, is SEO something that's going to be important either to the application itself or just in general what you're trying to do around it? And something that Justin just kind of touched on very early, but I made a note on because I did want to come back to it, is the offline capabilities. We're obviously in a very connected world, and it's becoming harder and harder to find a place in the world where you're not connected to something. But I can think of quite a few instances off the top of my head where that offline capability is important to be able to, complete a document or fill out a survey or fill out a form or cache some data and things along those lines. So all of those are becoming very important questions, but I've kind of saved the big one for the end because it's going to open up a can of worms, I know, and Justin is going to tell me that this should be an entire podcast by itself. But security between single-page applications and multi-page applications, security just in a general sense would seem to be a little more difficult to deal with in the land of single-page applications, because you are putting all of the business logic and all the heavy lifting on the browser, on the end user. And Daniel, you even mentioned earlier that there are some inherent security risks with that, not to mention some of the long-term things. So I want to talk a little bit about securing these two different general kinds of applications and some of the caveats or complexities or issues that we might run into with those. So I want to go to Justin first because I know he's got a lot of experience in the security space. So give us a quick little rundown on the comparative here between the two as it relates to security.
Yeah, it's kind of a big question. It's a lot to kind of tackle as like one giant question. There's probably a bunch of different facets of it. I think one thing for maybe someone who's a really good single page like React or Angular developer who doesn't have too much backend or database experience, but you have a hammer and everything looks like a nail, and they're good enough to be dangerous, so they can step into the backend and set up like a little API that like this little bit of like work probably with like a Mongo database. So back to our full JavaScript stack, we have a little call to React front end, and then we've got a little Node server that just is really thin and just kind of acts as like an intermediary between the database. And then we're stuffing this all into a Mongo database, which has no relationships and no structures, and is basically, for lack of a better description, a giant folder full of JSON files. That could be really problematic for security, especially if you have all of your front end logic doing all of your authorizations and things that people are and aren't supposed to see and things. If that's all happening in the front end, the first thing we do when we pen test something is we set up a proxy between our front end and the requests that go out, and then we just capture those requests and do whatever we want with them. So if your front end is enforcing this mechanism and your back end is depending on the front end being a nice guy, that's a problem. That's an inherent security no-no. And it's really a lot more common in the context of single page applications, especially when there's someone who's a really good front end developer who makes beautiful stuff, but maybe doesn't have that security or application background. And then just to tee off on that with this Mongo database construction, oftentimes that's just not the right call because these relationships should be enforced and are really important. Or maybe there are other reasons that Mongo, like you need to do reporting later, for example. Maybe there's other reasons that Mongo just aren't the right call for whatever your business is. And you kind of got shuffled into this because someone's like, oh, it's just JSON objects. That'll be easy. Having the backend not do its own security and then maybe lacking some of that database enforced validation and structure from someone who's maybe not super talented with databases or specifically how to configure Mongo. So those are big no-nos. On the front end, single page applications, we basically don't see cross-site scripting in anymore. So I'll give them the win for that. They've turned, I mean, I'm sure you can write, I know for a fact you can write XSS in them, but they make it a lot harder. So that's a big one for single page applications. These frameworks and stuff have really helped out with front end security in terms of XSS. And I guess the bundle library problem is a separate issue where it's now like a full-time job to keep these libraries up to date. But did I miss anything big that you would add on to that, Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really think that security is a big consideration for me in deciding between whether to do an SPA architecture or do more of a standard monolithic architecture. There's just different considerations. Definitely 5-6 years ago, well, maybe going back further than that, I don't know, a while ago, it was very common to find XSS vulnerabilities all over the web. I mean, they're still there for sure. And, an XSS vulnerability is basically you stick some nasty code into some user input somewhere that you can then get to basically execute script on a user's browser, or you could do it with like a URL parameter. So you send someone a link in their email, hey, click this link and win $1 million, and they click it, and then it actually executes code on the browser. And so this was a really common, I mean, it still is a problem, but it has actually gotten a lot better in the world of SPAs because Angular, React, it is so hard to write an XSS vulnerability. I mean, you can still do it. I see people do it all the time. Believe me, I work with some bad code. But in general, it's pretty hard to do. So I think on that side, technologies like Angular and React have really made that a lot better. One of the big ones, I mean, Justin talked to this as well, and I don't want to beat it to death, but authorization should really come from the back end. And that's a mistake that people tend to make when they're working with these architectures. We hit the button, you can't see the button, and therefore it's safe. It's very hard to make your back end policies match your front end. There's been a lot of efforts to try to make this happen, but it's very challenging.
Security by obscurity, right?
Absolutely, and especially when you have one developer working on the front end and one developer working on the back end. I mean, it's very hard to make these two things sync up, and so you oftentimes wind up in the situation where there's a button on the front end, you click it, you get a big nasty authorization error. Like, well, that should never happen. If there's a button on the front end, I should be allowed to click it. I'm logged in, I should be able to do it. But you should always be starting your authorization from the back end, from the API endpoint. You should say, before it goes to the database, we're going to make sure that you are actually able to update this record. And if it causes an error upstream, that's fine. That's on the next guy. So it should start there. A lot of these apps, they don't start that way. A lot of them, they just start with the front end. If we're going to hide the button, and we're never going to make sure it's secure in the back end, and it's a big deal.
A lot of times on these single page applications, like the back ends end up being really, really thin, which arguably is a benefit. But I think other things will happen where people upload all their maps and all their source to publicly facing things, and all the applications in the front end, all the applications publicly available, and they're not obscuring it or taking these other actions sometimes. So an attacker can go and download your entire application, all the logic. They can host it at a different place. They can point it at their really thin, really easy, fast to write back end. It's definitely a vulnerability for people making exact replicas of your application that are literally indistinguishable for the user except for maybe the URL, and then piping that off to some little tiny server that they control. And that's a thing that happens a lot in front-end applications is people don't take the time to minify and jumble and obscure their front-end code. It's also just an IP concern where you don't want people to download literally your 95% of your application because all your business logic is in the front end.
Fair enough. Yeah. And like I said, I know that security in and of itself, that's like a whole series of conversations and different things that we can talk about there, but just kind of hitting those high points. So guys, we're about at time, but just kind of want to come back to any last thoughts, Daniel or Justin, on single page application versus multi-page application, questions that might need to be answered, just, things in general that you might want to tell, somebody that's moving into the application space, or someone who is looking to turn their application into a software as a service, just to make sure that they are considering. Let's start with Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. If you are a SaaS founder, if you're looking to build a SaaS product, I don't think there's any reason that you should run scared of somebody saying, we're going to do this as an SPA. I also don't think there's any reason that you should just embrace that with wide arms. I think there's a lot of questions you have to ask yourself, and we've touched on a lot of them here. Are you trying to build something that's optimized for SEO? Are you building like a marketplace that people need to go to? How important is interactivity? How important is responsiveness? I think there's a lot of things you need to ask yourself, and there's not just really like a one-size-fits-all solution. I think for a lot of things, if you're coming in and you're going to have a really mobile app forward business, that's basically what you're doing, is you're making a mobile app, and you want that to also be on the web. You want people to go to it, and you also want to minimize your development time on that. I think that's a really good time to be considering doing something in React Native. You're going to build your mobile app in React Native, then you can use React Native Web or straight old-fashioned React Web to build the front-end part of the web application. I think that makes a lot of sense. If you're trying to build something like Facebook, a social media site where people click a like button and you want it to light up immediately, I think there's a very strong argument to be made for doing an SPA. If you're doing something that's more business software forward, I think generally in those cases, you're going to want to look for something that's more monolithic. You're probably going to want to look at I'm a big fan of Ruby on Rails. That's my jam. So I would say most things, I'd probably just encourage you in the direction of Ruby on Rails. I think is probably the good call there. But yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution, I guess would be my takeaway.
Sure. Justin, final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's complicated and no two sites are the same. And it's not like you can't just like make one recommendation for everybody. I think my kind of flowchart for deciding where to recommend somebody starts with, is there a strong reason we shouldn't do it in Ruby on Rails? And second question is there a strong reason that Ruby on Rails front end and visual UI and interactivity features won't support what we need? And I very rarely answered no to those. I mean, it does come up sometimes. To Daniel's point, having one monolithic code base that powers the entire front end, and I can send that to the Google Play Store, to the App Store, and have that same code base power the web, and all that stuff works together. That's beautiful and powerful and absolutely a win. And that's a great reason why you wouldn't want to use Rails for the front end. So I'd answer, if this is primarily a mobile app, done, React Native all day. I think there are categories of applications, like if you're making a calculator or something that just maybe there's some really complex computations that have to happen, but you don't want to just like have an Excel spreadsheet with a giant numbers of sheets and formulas. Yeah, if it's all just front end and you're entering data and spitting it back out, there's a lot. Why would you have a back end for that? There's no reason to. That's another huge win for when you might use a single page application. But yeah, those are kind of the two main ones. I mean, there could be other considerations, but primarily if you're not looking at like one of those two things, I think it's probably likely that moving to a single page app is not the right place for you. Especially now that the Turbo is a thing. Like Rails interactivity features now are just so powerful that it's kind of like, yeah, unless we're going to put this in the App Store, I just don't see the reason.
I'm really glad you brought that up. Can I give a spiel about Turbo? Well, I think if you're going to have the conversation about SPA versus not SPA, I mean, I think you'd be remiss not to talk about all the cool things you can do with Turbo and Ruby on Rails these days. So Turbo, this whole thing started as Turbo Links way back in the day, super early on in Ruby on Rails land. I think it's been around since like Rails 2 or 3. I mean, it goes back a long ways. And basically the idea behind Turbo Links is that we're going to cache a huge portion of your page. And then when you click a button, we actually use JavaScript and we talk to the server and we ask the server, hey, how would you render the page? And it would be like, well, here's how the page would look after we render it. And then JavaScript would kind of replace it for you in the front end. So you're not actually really running a front end application, but there's a JavaScript library that is running in your application that's reaching out to the server and asking how it should re-render it. That has now evolved dramatically from there. And these days we have a piece of technology called TurboStream, which is just incredible. TurboStream is like you click a button and the button goes and makes a request to the server, and it actually will do like the same post request. So if it's like a delete button, well, you wouldn't use post for delete, but if it's a delete button, you'd make the delete request back to the server and you say, hey, I want to delete this user record. The server then answers with this teensy tiny little snippet that says, hey, here's how you need to update your DOM. And And the browser just does that. The browser says, oh, okay, great. So that user record's just gone. Great. And then it just removes the user record. And that's the whole update that comes back from the server. So it's still happening on the server. The server is still updating the database. The server is still figuring out how to render the view, but you're not re-rendering the entire page. You're just re-rendering this tiny little snippet. And so it's super snappy. It's super responsive. I guarantee if you sit down and use an app that's been well built using modern turbo technology, you'd probably be like, oh, this is probably written in Angular or React or Vue or Ember or any of these other ones. Until you actually look at the source code and you're like, really, this is Ruby on Rails? That old dinosaur that's been around for decades? Like, yeah, that old dinosaur has some pretty cool tricks. So Turbo's pretty awesome, and I would definitely say, consider that for pretty much any application. I mean, I think there are exceptions, mobile apps and all sorts of things, but definitely where I would start would be the same as Justin. You bring me an app you want to write, a web application you want to write. Yeah, why wouldn't we write it in Ruby on Rails? And you'd have to make a strong case not to do it for me to start going down my flowchart and finding another answer these days.
Fair enough. I think we found one of Daniel's favorite topics. So I have to have him back for unloading all things fun with Turbo.
Turbo is absolutely fantastic, and it gets you all of that interactivity and sexiness that you're looking for interaction, but not solving the issues of the mess and nightmare of state management and caching. So it's a good mix.
Indeed, and answer some of those earlier questions too. Well, guys, that pretty much wraps us up for today. Special thanks, of course, Daniel Cannon. Thanks so much, Justin Edwards. And thank you all for hanging out with us today. Thanks for cruising along with us on SaaS That App. We hope you grabbed some insights that were inspiring, actionable, or at least entertaining.
If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review.
Until next time, keep building, keep growing, and keep those apps sassy.